Don't forget that you're listening to Nightmare. My story begins in November 2016 when I worked as a security guard at a shopping mall. On the 16th of that month, my supervisor asked me to cover a 24-hour shift just once, and I agreed since I would soon need permission to take a day off. During my shift, my colleague and I had to collect signatures from stores to verify that all patrols had been conducted. After midnight, the last place to close was a restaurant. My colleague asked me to go get the signature, but as I approached, I felt something strange. An invisible force made me fix my gaze on the road, and that's when I saw her. A female figure with eyes glowing like an animal's in the darkness. I couldn't move. Fear had completely paralyzed me. Frozen in terror, I heard my colleague calling me over the radio, but I couldn't respond. The woman started walking toward me, and what disturbed me the most was how she crossed the road as if nothing was in her way. At that moment, I heard my colleague praying through the radio. He had also seen her through binoculars. Finally, I managed to move and ran back to the security booth. As I glanced back, I saw that the woman was still approaching. She got so close that I estimate she was only about 20 or 25 meters away. I quickly shut the booth door, and in the midst of panic, we lost track of time. When I checked the clock, it was already 3:15 a.m., and the woman's presence had disappeared. That night, the atmosphere became heavy and oppressive, and we couldn't even remember how the hours had passed. We slept uneasily until our phone alarms woke us at 7 a.m., signaling the shift change. We decided not to include anything in the report because we knew we would be considered crazy. We simply wrote that everything had gone smoothly. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Who was that woman? Did everything I saw really happen? From that day on, I never accepted another 24-hour shift, and I was left with the lingering question of what I had truly experienced that night at the shopping mall. The story I'm about to tell is real, and it happened in the summer of 1997 when I was 19 years old. My grandfather was suffering from lung cancer and was in his final month of life. Despite his declining health, he insisted on going outside, saying, "I'm going to die anyway." The strangest thing was his attitude. He wasn't afraid or anxious. One night, he woke up distressed, claiming that someone had been watching him through the window all night. Our house was on the ground floor with a patio that made it easy to see inside. But who could have been standing outside for hours, just watching? We thought it might be a hallucination caused by his illness. The following week, his condition worsened and he stopped going outside. However, he remained obsessed with the presence at his window. One night, he described the figure, a tall man with his face hidden in shadows, dressed elegantly and wearing a hat. That night, I felt uneasy and struggled to sleep. At around 4 in the morning, my grandfather's screams woke us up. My mother, who was caring for him, rushed into his room, and at that moment, we heard the sound of breaking glass. It was his window. When we managed to calm him down, he told us that the man had spoken to him, telling him his time was near. He described the voice as deep and disturbing. The next day, his health collapsed, and we took him to the hospital, where doctors confirmed that he could pass away at any moment. Finally, we decided to bring him back home. When we arrived, all the windows were open and the air inside was unusually cold, despite the summer heat outside. That night, I heard him talking to himself, and when I peeked into his room, I saw him standing in front of the window, looking skeletal and trembling. He had never shown fear of death before, but now he was whispering that he didn't want to go. Hours later, I woke up to strange noises and saw the shadow of the man with the hat reflected on the wall. We ran into my grandfather's room and found him banging against the wall, sobbing that the man had left but would return for him. By morning, he had died of a heart attack. Months later, we learned that the previous tenant of the house had experienced the same thing and had died in a similar manner. Was it just a coincidence? During a weekend emergency room shift, we received 6 patients with gunshot wounds. Among them was a young man with wounds to his chest, abdomen, and face. His cheek was torn open, exposing his teeth and bone. His condition was critical, and we knew he wouldn't survive, so we only provided first aid and stabilized him. However, as hours passed, he astonishingly remained alive despite the massive blood loss. Eventually, when the situation calmed down, the surgeon asked me to assist in suturing his cheek. But then, the patient opened his eyes and, in a clear voice, said, "She is here. Take this off my arm because it won't let me die." The doctor, surprised, asked who he was referring to. "The revered spiritual figure," he replied. "I promised to get a tattoo if she saved me. But now she won't let me go." We all shuddered and looked at his arm, where a large tattoo of the revered spiritual figure was inked. The doctor tried to calm him, but the patient insisted, desperately pleading for it to be removed. The most unsettling thing was his clarity despite such fatal injuries. Finally, the surgeon gave in and, after administering anesthesia, began removing the tattooed skin. As soon as the last fragment was separated from his body, the monitor flatlined. The patient had died instantly. A deathly silence filled the room, followed by a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped. We exchanged glances, unsure of what to say, feeling that something beyond our understanding had just happened. I will never forget that moment, and the eerie feeling it left behind, a lingering doubt. Had the revered spiritual figure truly been keeping him in this world? The story I'm about to tell happened in the 1970s in a small town. Although I want to protect my mother's identity, she has never given up hope of learning more about these terrifying events. Perhaps through this medium, someone may recognize the story, or even help me find some of the real people involved, so I can finally tell my mother what happened next. Everything I will recount is what she told me, an experience that shaped her youth. At that time, my mother was just a teenager and lived almost alone with my grandmother, as my grandfather spent most of the year traveling for work. However, the house was never truly empty. My grandmother was very active in the religious community and constantly received visits from nuns, priests, and devoted churchgoers who gathered to read the Bible. One night, my mother was awakened by the sound of someone desperately knocking on the door. She heard her grandmother get up and answer it. Curious, she stopped before reaching the entrance, where her grandmother was speaking with the young priest. Shortly after, the church's senior priest, a man very close to the family, arrived. The three of them talked for a few moments and then left. My mother approached her grandmother to ask what was happening, but the only response she received was, "There has been an accident, my child. Come pray with me." She didn't understand at the time, but the next day she learned that one of the church's most devoted women had suffered a tragic accident at home and had passed away. The death of that woman was a heavy blow to the community. For days, the atmosphere in the church was somber, and gatherings became even more frequent. The novena in her honor was held at my grandmother's house. But something caught my mother's attention. The deceased woman's husband did not show up even once. Being so young, she didn't think much of it. However, soon, things took a chilling turn. One afternoon, as she returned from school, her grandmother told her that the young priest had visited their house and had requested the presence of the community for a very important prayer at the church. That evening, my mother and her grandmother went without hesitation. When they arrived, the church was closed, but a few nuns greeted them and guided them inside. There, several women from the community were already gathered, along with the young priest. However, when he saw them, his face showed surprise and concern. "Ma'am, I'm not sure your daughter should be here," he said. But the grandmother insisted, saying her daughter was a young woman of faith and that all hands were needed for the prayer. Though the priest seemed unconvinced, he allowed my mother to stay and asked everyone to follow him. Together they walked to the old convent, an imposing building with centuries of history. As they moved through the hallways, the nuns seemed uneasy, hurrying along without paying much attention to the visitors. In one of the largest halls, the elder priest of the parish was waiting for them. He looked exhausted, but he was visibly moved and thanked them for coming. "I have a very important request," he said in a trembling voice. "When we cross that door, close your eyes. Do not open them for any reason. No matter what you hear, what you feel, or what happens around you, if anyone thinks they cannot do this, it's better to leave now. The women exchanged fearful glances, but none of them stepped back. The priest turned directly to my mother and asked, "Do you think you can endure this, child?" With a lump in her throat but unwilling to leave her grandmother alone, she answered yes. They held hands and, with their eyes shut, entered the room. The priest began to pray in Latin as he sprinkled holy water. The moment they stepped inside, an intense cold engulfed them, as if they had walked into a freezer. Even with her eyes closed, my mother could feel something watching her. It was a terrifying sensation, as if this presence could see through her, read her thoughts, and feed on her fear. A hoarse, guttural laugh began to echo in the room, followed by insults and mockery, each directed at the women by name. The priest shouted firmly, "Do not open your eyes! Do not stop praying!" But the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. One of the women began to sob, and the chain of hands broke in some places. My mother heard people stumble, hesitating, their breathing ragged. A foul stench filled the air. It smelled like rotting flesh. Suddenly, the nuns outside began to scream, and a door burst open with a loud bang. The sound of other doors slamming open in the hallway followed, echoing with terrifying force. Then came the screams, piercing, anguished cries. The demonic laughter was no longer confined to the room. It resonated throughout the entire convent. At that moment, my mother could take no more. For just a second, she opened her eyes, and what she saw would haunt her forever. In the center of the room, strapped to a bed with thick leather restraints, was the husband of the deceased woman. His eyes were bulging, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, as if something invisible was holding him in the air. His body hovered slightly, barely held down by the restraints. His face was contorted in an expression of pure hatred. My mother shut her eyes immediately, trembling in terror, and prayed even harder. Minutes later, the voice faded, and the nuns entered to help the women leave the room without opening their eyes. When they gathered again in the church, the priest thanked them for their bravery and asked them never to speak of what had happened. He assured them they would not have to return. Shortly after, both priests were transferred without explanation, and the nuns stopped visiting my grandmother's house. The community was never the same again. Over time, rumors spread about a dark figure that could be seen standing on the church tower at night. Some said screams of agony still echoed within the convent walls. My mother grew up and, over the years, distanced herself from religion. But to this day, whenever she recalls that night, her body trembles. She never truly knew what had happened that night, nor what became of the possessed man. Perhaps someone else in that community still remembers. Perhaps the elderly women who witnessed it told the story to someone else. But one thing is certain, none of those who were there that night ever spoke of the horror they witnessed. My mother read this story before sending it, and as she remembered, a few tears escaped her eyes. I don't know if they were tears of sadness or fear. Thank you for reading. Thank you for listening. What I'm about to tell you today is not the story of a subscriber, nor is it a tale distant from us. It is something that reached us through an email a few days ago. During a gathering with friends, I decided to ask about their most extreme paranormal experiences. While not everyone had their own encounters, they all knew stories that had happened to someone close to them. That's how I heard about my friend's family. It all began when her parents bought a house near the city center over a decade ago. It was a unique opportunity, a spacious and affordable home for the area. They paid the down payment with their savings and financed the rest with a loan. At that time, my friend was just a child, and her mother was pregnant with her second daughter. She didn't remember everything exactly, but she knew perfectly well why they had to move out. The first few months passed without issue, but my friend's mother began to suffer from anxiety attacks. She constantly felt nervous, as if she were in danger and needed to leave the house. At first, they attributed it to pregnancy stress and hormonal changes, so she tried to downplay it. However, over time, the feeling of unease did not disappear, it only grew stronger. Then the nightmares began. In them, she saw a completely burned man walking through the house. In her dreams, she would watch him move through the living room, walk to the dining area, and, upon realizing they were upstairs, he would suddenly turn and head straight for her daughter's bedroom. My friend's mother saw the burned man in her dreams standing by her daughter's bed, staring at her. She also saw him next to her own bed while she slept, watching her and her husband. No matter how terrifying these dreams were, she never managed to wake up in the moment. She would only wake up at dawn, drenched in sweat and feeling exhausted. Desperate, she told her own mother what was happening. My friend's grandmother decided to move in with them for a while to help with household chores and caring for the child. At first, things seemed to improve with her presence, but it wasn't long before the nightmares returned, more intense than before. Now, in her dreams, the burned man didn't just walk. He slammed his head against the walls and ran through the house in a rage. He left bloodstains on everything he touched, and pieces of his skin would fall off. The worst moment came when my friend's mother dreamed that he violently entered the room where her daughter and grandmother were sleeping. Filled with uncontrollable rage, he launched himself at them, attacking them furiously. The scene was so realistic and terrifying that this time she managed to wake up. She ran to her daughter's room, only to find both of them peacefully asleep. However, from that moment on, the grandmother also began to experience strange events in the house. One day, while returning from the store with groceries for breakfast, the grandmother saw a disfigured figure staring at her from one of the house's windows. At that moment, only her daughter was inside. She entered quietly, not wanting to alarm her, and searched the entire house, but found nothing. After that, the sightings became more frequent. The grandmother began to see shadows moving down the hallway, figures passing from the kitchen to the dining room, and shapes rushing up the stairs when she was sitting in the living room. Although she knew something was wrong, she tried to remain calm to avoid alarming her daughter, who was in the final stages of pregnancy. When the baby was born, everything seemed to return to normal. My friend's mother was so happy with her new daughter that she completely forgot about the nightmares and anxiety. Even the grandmother stopped seeing strange things around the house. However, the peace lasted only 3 months. One night, the baby was restless and kept crying, so her mother decided to let her sleep in her bed. In the middle of the night, the mother dreamed once again of the burned man, but this time it was different. In her dream, he furiously climbed the stairs. At that exact moment, the baby cried out in real life, waking her up abruptly. When she opened her eyes, she saw the burned man standing in a corner of the room. At first, she thought she was still dreaming, so she closed her eyes to wake up. But when she opened them again, the burned man was now in the center of the room, closer to her. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but when she opened her eyes a third time, she saw him standing right next to her bed. My friend's mother was overwhelmed by an intense burnt smell, and a paralyzing fear took over her body. She couldn't scream or move. At that moment, she saw the man extend his hand toward the baby. Just as he was about to touch her, the child let out a horrifying scream that woke up the father. He immediately turned on the light and picked up the baby, trying to calm her down. The mother, terrified and in tears, tried to explain what she had seen. The grandmother, alarmed by the screams, rushed in and attempted to comfort her. Although the father didn't know what to think, the grandmother believed every word. From that moment on, the family began searching for a new home. They endured months of terrifying experiences in that house, but none as horrifying as that night. Finally, almost a year later, they managed to sell the house and move away. Since leaving, my friend's mother never suffered from anxiety attacks or nightmares again. They never found out who the burned man was or why he haunted that house.